Hello, everyone, and welcome to Profitable Pastures 2022. My name is Terry Noon, and I am the chair of the Ontario Forage Council. Thank you to Beef Farmers of Ontario for their generous partnership of this year's webinar series. Today's speaker is brought to you by Ontario Sheep Farmers, Minto Ag Limited, and SGS Canada Laboratories. Thank you very much to our sponsors. Today's session is called Grazing Ruminants, the original soil builders, lessons learned from my Nuffield Scholarship. Our presenter, Ryan Boyd, is a family farmer from Forest, Manitoba, who is passionate about soil health, forage-efficient cattle, and no-till cropping systems. As a 2019 Nuffield Scholar, Ryan traveled the world investigating different grazing systems and has brought many insights home, including the practice of total grazing. I'd like to welcome Ryan as our guest speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Terry. And thank you, Christine O'Reilly, for the invitation here to share some of my learnings and some of the things I gathered on my tour around the world on the Nuffield Scholarship and what I've learned here at home, farming and grazing over the last several years. So I'll jump right into it. As Terry mentioned, I had the good fortune of receiving a Nuffield Scholarship, a 2019 Nuffield Farming Scholarship. So for anyone that isn't familiar with that, what that is an opportunity to travel the world, tap into a network of Nuffield Scholars, previous Nuffield Scholars, the world over. So Nuffield itself, Nuffield organization is an international organization with member countries. So I think we're in 13 different countries. I think it's getting up to around 1,700 scholars that have been through the program, with a new batch of scholars every year. So in Canada, what that looks like, you get a $15,000 bursary to go towards your travel expenses. You commit to a minimum of 10 weeks of international travel. And you get to choose a topic of study. And in my case, I am a diehard grazer, so I chose to look at grazing ruminants and where they fit in the ever evolving agriculture industry. So where did this take me? It started off in March of 2019, Ames, Iowa, for a contemporary scholars conference, they call it. So there was about, what was there now, about 70 or 80 Nuffield scholars from around the world come together for a week-long conference. Talked about all different issues concerning agriculture, and basically just had a week of networking and yeah, just a mind-boggling few days to get to meet people that are up to all kinds of different things all over the place. And then from there, I took off on what Nuffield calls a global focus program. So with that, there was 7 of us in our group. We traveled together for 2 months, went to Washington, D.C., Florida, Mexico, Brazil, Netherlands, and New Zealand. And we kind of looked at everything and all things agriculture. From we met with politicians, we met with farmers, researchers, producer groups, visited all kinds of different every end of agriculture that you could think of. We kind of covered a lot of bases, just to get a broad general scope of what's going on around the world. And then from there, on my personal study, in August of 19, I did a bit of a road trip down through South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota. And then in February of 2020, kind of right before the pandemic took its grip on the world, I hit up Florida again, Georgia, Texas, California, New South Wales, Australia, and West Australia, and the UK. And then I came home a little bit early just with the way things went, but I covered a huge ton of ground and really had my mind wide open to new ideas and just really shaped how I view the world and agriculture. So a quick shout out to my sponsors. Of course, the Nuffield itself had a specific sponsor to my scholarship, and that was the Western Grains Research Foundation. but I was able to solicit a few other local businesses and organizations here in Western Canada and Manitoba that also sponsored and really made it possible for me to do the traveling that I did and get the experience that I had with Nuffield. So I'll be forever grateful to all the sponsors that are up on that screen there right now. So Grazing Ruminants, a resilient long-term solution to agriculture, productivity, profitability, and climate change. Now, just to give a little bit of backstory, so I've kind of been, I came home to the farm here where I farm with my mom and dad and my wife. We've got 2 young kids, and we're traditionally like a mixed farm. We're about 3,000 acres in size. We've always had a few cattle. I went to University of Manitoba, studied agronomy, came back to the farm around 2005. And that was kind of before the grain prices. Grain farming really wasn't cool just yet. And so in a trying to find a way to make my carve a spot for me on the farm, I really got caught up in holistic management, intensive managed grazing, and regenerative agriculture. And so that's kind of the path we've been on here for 10, 15 years now. And it seemed like one of the most elusive tenet of soil health and regenerative agriculture is the livestock integration. It seems like everybody's after that. That's kind of the holy grail. But the reality is, in my experience, and I think for a lot of people, is how do we do that profitably? Yeah, we know that the prairies evolved with grazing ruminants and perennial grasses, and it makes a super fertile, carbon-rich soil that has enabled the bread baskets of the world to exist as we know it today with the grain production. But how do we get back to that to maintain and increase the quality of the soil? So that's where I set off from my starting point, looking for people who were effectively doing that, making a profitable farming system with grazing ruminants as the centerpiece. And I think this quote really stood out in my mind that somebody had up at the Contemporary Scholars Conference in Iowa was, "We travel because we need to, because distance and difference are the secret tonics to creativity. When we get home, home is still the same, but something in our minds has changed, and that changes everything." And I think we're all looking forward to maybe doing a bit of traveling here after we've been kind of grounded for the last year and a half, 2 years. I think it's long overdue that we can get out, and you don't know what you don't know, and that's one of the things with the Nuffield experience, getting out there and visiting different things, seeing different things that I had no idea existed, and even if I did know that they existed, your perception is totally different when you get to put your boots on the ground and actually set foot in the field or the pasture and talk to the farmer. There's no replacement for that firsthand experience. So there's the crew that we traveled with on the Global Focus program. Australia, New Zealand, the UK, England and Ireland, all represented there. So we took off, as I said. I'll whip through these real quick here. We're in Washington, D.C. One of the things that I know that I have taken for granted for far too long is the fact that we live next door to the empire that the U.S. is, and that was really reinforced visiting with the other scholars from around the world, and then being in Washington itself. It's just something that I think a lot of us as Canadians take that for granted. From Washington down to Florida, saw some very intense tomato production, carrot production, and you got to remember where I'm coming from. I'm all regenerative ag. That's all I'm seeing. Reduced fertilizer, reduced pesticide thing. That's the only way forward. So it was a really stretch of my imagination to set foot on the tomato fields in Florida, where they're like fumigating the soil, super intensive. Not what I would have thought regenerative, but it all has its place in our current system, and there's reasons the way things are. And it was good for me to get exposed and stretch my mind just to understand a little bit better why things are the way they are. Another stop in Florida growing leafy greens there. Like some of this company here was mostly based in California, but have migrated to the East Coast because of water issues and trucking. From Florida down to Mexico to Simmet Cereal Research Center. That's where Norman Borlaug developed the semi-dwarf wheat that has really changed the way like food security around the world, with increasing that harvest index so much. Yield increases have really plateaued though over the last couple decades since the introduction of the semi-dwarfs really brought the yield up, but now they're more breeding to keep ahead of the disease and those types of issues. And that's where I really think that this lends its hand to like the systems-based approach, like integrating the livestock, thinking about how we improve the soil. I think the next major gains in efficiency of agriculture systems are going to come from the system itself, the systems-based approach. From Mexico to Brazil, we were on farms big and small in Brazil, from a small organic vegetable farm that had retail outlets in major cities, compared to the next day we'll be on a farm that was Bom Futuro, the largest soybean grower in the world. So just really, really different to see the labor issues in Brazil. Like we worry about labor here in Canada, there's tons of labor there. So it just totally changes what they're able to do. Like here they are fixing up this cattle handling facility. There was, I don't know how many people there redoing the stones in the ground, building the fence. Soybeans really are king there. On some of the more harder or tougher soils, they'd figured out that they integrate their cattle, have a brief perennial phase, 2 or 3 years in the rotation that becomes 25% more profitable. So in the land of Brazil, where there's really no subsidies to speak of, they make it on their own on business. Business decisions are not skewed by outside forces. They realize the value of having the livestock in the rotation. And then again, from one extreme to the next, we went from Brazil to the Netherlands, highly sophisticated, very developed farming systems, super technologically advanced. Hog business making good money when we were there in 2019. Wind energy. This was on a farm. Another Nuffield Scholar from the Netherlands, he was growing garlic there. Of course, a lot of greenhouse production there. This fella at Copert's Crest was growing these microgreens, had built a huge business exporting these all over the world. And then from Netherlands to New Zealand, really a lesson on, again, high value production. The kiwi fruit industry, hops industry, apple production, wine, and of course, the New Zealand also has lots of livestock integration, both with the dairy, intensively managed grazing dairies, but also in the crop production areas. There's lots of sheep and cattle or replacement dairy heifers grazing cover crops and forage in the off season there. So as my head is set spinning with that global focus program, I kind of came home, spent a few months at home putting the crop in, thinking about everything I'd just seen. And then the next winter in February of 2020, I took off on my own for a couple of months traveling around. So kind of really started, that's when I started to drill down on just figure out, okay, where do the grazing ruminants fit into this whole equation? So the first thing that kind of stood out, as I probably shouldn't have needed any reminding of this at all, was like the traditional livestock integration. And you know, the Australians really do this as well as anyone in West Australia, where they do a lot of chaff grazing. So what you're looking at here in the top corner is just a simple attachment on that combine to direct the chaff into a narrow band. And then the cattle would just roam the roam the fields, dry cows in their summer, and they're just at maintenance. And I couldn't believe the body condition of those cows eating what looked to be very little. And some of the one farm that I was on in West Australia, they very large operation of like 50,000 acres, and I think like 20,000 cows, like a huge operation. They attributed their past financial success, like 20 years running. The fellow told me, he said, we've been profitable every year, and they attribute it to having the cattle in the system with the crops. So how they were integrating the cattle, and sheep were also on that farm. They could actually graze. They call it grain and graze. So their winter wheat, essentially like what we would have winter wheat. Cattle could graze the wheat. They'd even graze canola prior to bolting, but when it was vegetative, they could get a month's worth of grazing off that, and not affect the final harvest yield of those crops. So it was like really double dipping, and very nice system. So 20 years ago, they would have had 2/3 of their area of that farm in pasture to support that amount of stock. But today they've swapped that. So instead of 2/3 pasture, it's 2/3 crop and 1/3 pasture, but the stocking rate has remained constant. So a very successful example of an integrated crop livestock farming system there in West Australia. And up here, this is some soil in the UK, where there's a lot of interest in getting back to like what they refer to as the herbal lay system, putting down those perennial lays with the forbs, with the legumes, the clover, plantains, that sort of thing, for 2-3 years in between their cropping rotation to build that soil up to add fertility. And that renewed interest is kind of spurred on a little bit with Brexit and the uncertainty around how the subsidies might change, and the need to build a more resilient, profitable system. So back a little closer to home, down at Dwayne Beck's in South Dakota at Dakota Lakes Research Farm. He's been kind of a leader in regenerative ag and low disturbance, no-till cropping systems for 20-30 years. And lately, his last hurrah here, I think Dwayne has retired just recently in the last year, I think, but he's really been promoting the reintegration of warm season perennial grasses into the cropping system. So I actually spent the afternoon with Dwayne there on Dakota Lakes, and this is I think that's big blue stem in that picture. They had big blue stem and some switchgrass that they were doing some research with that on their farm scale or field scale plots to kind of monitor the changes in the soil and the soil function. Because here on the prairies in the West, like, we've all but eliminated the warm season perennial component from our pastures and certainly our cropping systems. We're now seeing a bit of corn moving in, but that is a big contributor to the building of the soils and the fertility that we have, that we are so grateful for. Our deep black soils were the warm season perennial grasses. So I really think whatever the grazing system is that you're implementing, need to be really considering getting some of those warm seasons back in the mix. So, and I mean, it's simple. The circular system of perennial grazing is there's less external cost. There's less, you're exporting less from the system. So it's really just more circular. So in the long run, that is going to be better. We won't need not as much fertilizer, not as much replacement inputs needed. So we've established that we want to have more warm season perennials, but why have we eliminated so much pasture? So why have we went away from those perennial systems and concentrated mostly on the biennials? Well, it's simple economics. The profitability of a grazing system compared to what is available for annual crops it's just not keeping up. But one of the fellows that I really wanted to meet, I've been I talked to in the past and had followed a little bit loosely was this Jaime Elizondo. And it seems to me he's learned from Johann Zietzman, and they've come up with a system of grazing that, to me, it made the most sense. If to develop a profitable grazing system, I think these guys are as close or as on the right track as anybody that I've seen in a purely perennial based system. So Jaime refers to this type of grazing called total grazing. So what that is ultra high stock density grazing. He keeps the cattle bunched up very tight at a very high density. Like we're talking, if you were to measure the live weight of cattle per acre while he's grazing, like we're talking 600,000 pounds per acre up to 1 million, even 2 million pounds per acre in some instances. So multiple moves per day. The cattle grazing behavior just changes. They graze totally different, very aggressively, non-selectively is the key word there. The cattle will graze everything indiscriminately, and they're not going to pick and choose and be hard on some species and less on the others. So what results from that is a very even distribution of manure and nutrients. It's a very efficient harvest of the forage, and from what I've seen, I think that lends itself to the most rapid improvement in landscape function that I've seen in any technique. So and what also happens is with that very high efficiency of harvest, the stocking rate is able to increase rather dramatically. So that if you've heard people say ultra high density grazing, severe non-selective grazing, I'm going to use those terms interchangeable with total grazing. To me, it's all kind of, we're talking the same thing there. So then, of course, as everybody thinks, okay, well, if you're going to graze that aggressive, you're going to shut down the plant. Like, it's common knowledge that the more forage you remove, the longer it's going to take to recover. So you're going to shut the roots down. And that was, of course, the first thing I said to Jaime, and he said, yeah, that's right. That's what the common dogma is, if you will. And it goes back to this gentleman by the name of Kreider in the US. I think it was in Missouri. He put out this paper on root growth stoppage in 1955. They did some research, and what it showed was when you take 90% of the forage, you shut the roots down for I think it was 1 or 2 weeks, or it was so many days you'd shut the roots down. So but what they saw is if you took less than 50% of the forage, the roots didn't stop growing. You didn't have an impact. So from that, we've developed kind of our mentality that grazing, we should aim to take as little as possible, as opposed to what Jaime's talking about in his total grazing, taking everything. But the difference here, as Jaime showed me, you can find this paper on the internet, look it up, and you can read it yourself. What they failed to acknowledge, or what they're not including with the results from that root growth stoppage paper, was it was young plants clipped with scissors. So it's a laboratory setting, like growth chambers, short recovery period. So it was about 30 days. And in the real world, we're looking at long recovery periods. We're looking at the stimulatory effect of saliva. We're looking at the impact that an even spread of manure and urine has on top of the ground. When you bunch the cattle up that tight and you move them that often, they stay out on the pasture and spread all that very evenly. And we have a diverse functioning soil ecosystem. And that is what as a result of the non-selective grazing versus selective grazing. To graze like they did in this root growth stoppage trial is impractical in nature. It just, you can't do it. So then after we looked at those cattle, Jaime took me over to this other site, and this was where he had total graze. They've been total grazing like this for several years, but this was a stockpile and this was a result. And you have to understand that this pasture here, we're down in Florida, it's like super sandy, very low fertility soil, not very productive at all. And they've added nothing to this except a little bit of compost extract. I think they were spraying on it when they first started a few years ago, and then just the animal impact and the cattle. I'm not sure if you can hear that or not.
It's pretty quiet.
Okay. Well, so if I don't know if I can pause that or not, but you see how dense those the grass tillers are on the ground. Like it's literally just a thick mat of forage. And now the thing is with total grazing, if you're going to take your high percentage of grazing, like we're talking 75, 80, 90% of the forage that is there, you have to precede that and follow that with a long recovery period. So that's what he has done here, is just several months worth of stockpile. And at the time when I was there, we were figuring, he thought it was around 300 cow days per acre, but he texted me after, when they did have the cattle in there, they harvested about 500 cow days per acre. Now his cows aren't that big, they're about 1,000 pounds, 900 to 1,000 pounds, but still huge production off of that. And by coupling this type of grazing with adapted genetics, with genetics that are lower maintenance forage efficient, he has dramatically increased his stocking rate. And you'll notice in that video there, when we're looking down at the pasture, that the growing points are not dead. That's the point that he's trying to make. Because we've grazed it so hard, it's starting from a even playing field. What happens is the regrowth is much leafier, much higher leaf to stem ratio, and it doesn't put up the seed head nearly as easily. So what happens is you just have a much higher quality, more dense volume of feed. So after seeing that in Florida, we came home and we kind of went all in with grazing like that at home here. So it's really a paradigm shift from a root-based recovery versus photosynthetic-based plant recovery. So in the scenario where most grazing experts are talking, you want to take half, leave half, or even less than that, just skim the top, and you don't want to totally defoliate the plant, because that's going to compromise the regrowth. But in the total grazing paradigm, we're basing our recovery on root-based recovery, so that we're having this long recovery period that allows those plants to totally recharge those roots, to express their full life cycle. And it's the reality is, when you allow the plant to express its full life cycle, that's when the real magic happens in the soil. When the plant is no longer worried about reproduction and just adding leaf, that's when it has the leaf and you allow it to grow and photosynthesize, that's when it's putting a lot more down into the soil, and that's when you're going to start to see the major shift in the soil ecology and improvements in the carbon come at a much more rapid pace. So key point, as I said, the long recovery period, I can't stress that enough. The stimulatory effect of the grazing, from the manure, the saliva, the hoof impact, and the functioning agro ecosystem. So this is a group of yearlings. This lifter here, obviously we don't have the labor at our disposal at low cost like they do in Florida or other places like South America. So we've got these automatic gate lifters. So we can go out in the morning, and what we do is about 4 moves per day. And we can go out in the morning, we give the cattle one break when we're there, and then we have 3 of these lifters. We can program them to go up at certain times throughout the day. So about every 2 or 3 hours, that thing will lift. Cattle see it or hear it. They come in, graze at that high density. Now this stock density here, I'm not sure what that is. It's well over 500,000 pounds per acre, I believe, right there. And then yeah, the goal of this system is by the end of the day, you're watching the gut fill on that animal. By the end of the day, if they're not chock full, you haven't gave them enough. But we're basically moving them to gut fill so that as long as the animal is satiated and that rumen is full, we're going to have a reasonable amount of performance and get the gains in landscape function that we're after. Here's another shot of this is our cow herd here. I think there's about 250 cows or so in this group, pairs. We calve in June, so this was in early August or mid-July. I think this photo was taken. So you can see how they're trampling a lot, but they are actually harvesting quite a bit. And when I'm talking about taking, say, 80% of the forage there, a lot of people get worried, well, the soil's going to be bare. But the reality is, if you're doing like a once over grazing once per year, you have significant growth. So 20% of a season-long recovery still leaves adequate litter on the surface. And you can kind of, it's hard to see right there, but the manure is spread all over. And by moving them 3, 4, 5 times a day, the cattle stay out on that pasture at the grazing front there at that temporary wire. So all the manure is out there in the field as opposed to back at the water trough or next to a bush or wherever they hang out if they weren't anticipating another move. So just a little bit of fun with math. I sat down with Jason Roundtree one day he's from Michigan, I guess, a big proponent of grass-fed, or maybe not so much grass-fed, but holistic management. And we were talking about how do we know where we're at with our grazing system, how efficient are we? And he suggested we should compare to local hay production. Work back from, think about what a good crop of hay produces in your area, and then work back if you're getting the harvest efficiency, if you're getting the production out of your cattle that you would if you'd have hayed that field. So in this example, I have 4,500 pounds of dry matter. Obviously, down east, you guys are going to be growing a lot more than that, I would assume, with more rainfall. But anyways, work it back. I've got 3% here. You should have used 2.5%, but work that back to how many animal units that pasture could potentially produce, and then kind of gauge that on where your current efficiencies are in your grazing system. So in our case, when I run those numbers, when I was operating in the old paradigm of like a photosynthetic based recovery system, my numbers for animal units harvested were nowhere near what the hay production was. And I think that's because when we graze, a take half, leave half, we never do get back to take that other half. And we like to think we're leaving that half hoping that future gains are going to be realized because of that. But I really haven't seen that on our farm. As long as the soil is covered, I'm fully prepared to take a much higher, more intensive grazing, because I'd rather graze once per season than 3 times. And I think I get way more productivity, a higher stocking rate by doing so. These numbers are a little hard to follow, but the point I'm trying to make is if you grazed with a 60-day recovery time versus the 90-day recovery time, I'm saying in my experience, I can get like 1.5 times the stocking rate with a 90-day recovery period versus a 60-day recovery period. And when I get that reduced stocking rate on the 60 days, when I come back the second time, I don't get that difference. I don't get that extra 50% grazing. So this is something you need to figure out on your own farm, in your own context, where that fits in. But I do challenge you to do some trials, figure out kind of where that sweet spot is on your pasture. And just a fun fact here, like with this math, so if it was 4,500 pounds of dry matter at 12% protein, that would be 72 pounds per acre of nitrogen and 17 pounds of phosphate. So if your cattle are going out in the pasture and grazing for a few hours and then going hanging out in the corner by the water or under a tree or something, you're missing out on all those nutrients. Now, I'm not totally convinced that the response we're seeing here is simply nitrogen. Like, I think it's as much microbial and the hoof impact and all of that. But just to illustrate that point, think about what is the value of those nutrients if you were going to fertilize your pasture. Like, I know in my experience, when we put urea on the pasture, it does increase. There's no denying it. You get an increase in production. So if for no other reason, you should be considering moving your animals multiple times a day, just simply because of the nutrient, the more even spread of nutrients across the pasture. And so here we are here. This is what the pasture looks like on our place after a total grazing. So this picture was taken, well, it was late summer. So this would have been end of July kind of thing. And we total grazed this, like grazed it very hard, and early May, end of May kind of thing. So really only 2 months later, but you'd think you're really doing damage, but look at the density of the leaves. The quality of leaf in that pasture is second to none. So we're looking at some Sicer milk vetch, and it's mostly Sicer milk vetch and meadow brome grass, but there's some orchard grass, there's some crested wheatgrass in there, and a few other things too, some alfalfa. But I was totally blown away by the impact that ultra high density, non-severe grazing was able to do here at home. And the other factor in all of this, when you go to a longer recovery period focused on the higher utilization rate, what you're doing is reducing your risk. So the weather has been so sporadic here lately, and I mean, let's face it always is. Like, we get extreme rain events followed by longer periods of dryness. Like, in some areas, sure, it rains a half an inch every week, and it's beautiful. But the reality is, in our temperate climate out west, we're looking at extreme rain events maybe once a summer, maybe even once every 2 summers. But like it seems like when the rain does come, it's coming much faster and more furious than ever before. So when you're focused on grazing once per year, you're basically setting your farm up to capitalize on that big rain event when it happens. So I really want to have all of that water available to soak in, and by having the most of the farm at full recovery or close to full recovery, that means it's probably used up most of the moisture in that soil profile. So when we get that 2 or 3 inch rain, it's all going in, it's not running off, and it just eliminates a ton of risk. Whereas when you're grazing on that shorter rotation with say a 30, 40, 50 day rotation, when you just nip a little bit, and then when you're coming back 30 days later or 50 days later, chances of having a big or significant rain event during that period of time is much smaller than if we were, say, doing a once over grazing. So it's something to think about. Like, the water really is the everything in the grazing world revolves around the water. So not only do we have to try and get water back out onto the land if we're going to get more cattle, more intensively managed cattle on the pastures or in the crop fields, we have to think about the infrastructure to do that. But we really have to think about how to make the most out of the big rain events when they come. So like this was a rain event we had 2020. Like, it rained one weekend, it settled in, we were dry, and we had like 10 inches of rain, and our farm soaked in there the first 6 inches of that. It did not run off. And when you think a 6-inch rain, most people would just say, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Like it's going to run off, it's going to wash out roads, it's going to make a big mess. But it, in a well-managed pasture scenario, it soaked in just fine. So that should be the number one goal. And I believe the long recovery period is the best way to capitalize on these large rain events. So Graham Hand, after I'd done all my traveling, I came home and I was kind of reviewing some of the notes and stuff that I had taken and thinking about everything I saw. And someone had mentioned this Graham Hand to me on my travels, and I started looking into him. And then so I lined up a Zoom meeting, and we got talking, and I felt like this guy, his knowledge base, his life experience was basically everything that I've just been trying to convey to you on what makes a profitable grazing system. He's talking that, he's been teaching that, he's been thinking about that for his whole career. So Graham is trained in holistic management. He's trained with Alan Savory. He's learned from Johann Zietzman, and he's been practicing this with farmers and on his own place for a number of years. So the one thing that Graham talks about is a safe to fail trial. So he's saying that you should go out and do these experiments to figure out what is the optimal recovery period on your farm, on your pasture, what is the optimal stock density, and set up some trials and figure it out on your own place. Like it might take you a year or two, but you do it on a scale it's not going to break you, but you do it on a big enough corner of your pasture that you're going to pay significant attention to it and just figure it out. And it all comes down to landscape function. Like he's very in tune with what landscape looks like that's improving as opposed to going backwards. And he showed me a graph. In Australia, there's a company that takes satellite images, and they look at the ground cover from these satellites, and they have an algorithm that can pick out the green plant material aside from the dead plant materials. So they can basically graph litter cover over time, and they can do this going back 30 years because of the historical satellite imagery. So the one property that Graham's been working with, they showed what kind of the baseline was traditional rotational grazing, like let's say you move them every 2 weeks, that sort of thing. Not really paying attention to the land, just it's by the calendar more or less. And the ground cover was not very good, and it's vibrating around. And then they went to holistic management, and it improved a bit, but it was still very sporadic. Like it really tracked the rainfall. So if one year it was drier, the litter cover went down. The next year there was more rain, it might go up. So that was an incremental improvement over the original scenario. But then where it took the next leap to a more steady, consistent ground cover, that was when they adopted this ultra high density, severe non-selective grazing. And he was talking 6-8 moves per day and doing that year round and grazing about 12 to 14 month recovery period. So, and this is in Australia, where they were grazing like cool season grass pastures as well. And he said, once they made the shift to the once a year or longer recovery period, that's when everything started to click. That's when the litter cover stabilized. That's when the water infiltration improved. That's when the diversity started to explode. And it really lends itself to a breeder focus. He figured if you're going to focus on this type of grazing, you need to be thinking about becoming a breeder, because the reality is, and we found this out the hard way on our own farm, when you start forcing the cattle to non-selectively graze, you're turning them back into that high fiber upcycler, which we've really moved away from that with our selection criteria with our bulls and EPDs. Like when we're testing our our breeding stock these days, it's in a feedlot scenario with a high energy ration. We've really selected way far away from the type of animal that thrives in this non-selective grazing system. So Graham really figures it's a breeding focus that you need to look at. And I agree with him there, but I do think there's opportunity to provide supplement, like strategic protein supplement is what Zietzman and Elizondo talk about, to get your cattle to perform adequately grazing these more fibrous, coarser grass plants. You need to think about your supplement regime. And again, Graham really big on focusing on like the long-term risk of a grazing scenario like what we're talking about versus even a cash cropping. He figures in the long term, hands down, the pasture-based system is going to come out ahead. So I encourage you to check out Graham on YouTube. I was just looking this morning, checking to see if he had any more new content out, and there's a video he gave a presentation, and it's from last year, I think last June, Nutrisoil videos. If you look that up, Graham Hand, he does a very nice job of summarizing kind of what practical grazing management in this high density grazing system looks like. Excuse me. And another point to make is, if you're going to manage your pastures profitably, and that's what we're here tonight talking about, you need to know your current inventory of forages. You need to calibrate your eye so that you at all times know your inventory of the forage. Like if you need to know how many animal days, around here we use animal unit days per acre. So we want to keep an inventory of each paddock, how many AU days are currently out there. So basically an inventory of the grass on hand, and we can manage our cattle inventories accordingly. We know that if we want to have 6 months of feed in front of these cattle, which is probably about where we like to be, almost one grazing season in inventory ahead of them, then you can manage accordingly. If you know when the drought is coming, like last summer when we had a very dry season followed by a dry fall the year before, we can manage our numbers accordingly and not get caught behind the 8 ball running out of grass and having cattle to sell into a market that's already depressed because of the drought. So Jim Garish, I spent an afternoon with him in Nebraska, and he really hammered that home, the need for an inventory. And he figures about once a month is what he tells his managers that he works with, to take a ride around the ranch and take inventory monthly of what you have for forage on hand. Another thing, like same old story, you need to know your gross margin, know your numbers. What are you making money with on your farm? Is it the backgrounding operation? Is it the developing heifers? Is it the cow calf? And be honest with yourself, where is it coming from? Because I think one of the issues that too many people have, we fall in love with our cattle. We do what we do because it's an emotional decision, and that's fine. If you know your goals, you know what you're trying to achieve, but you need to be aware of where the profit is coming from in the operation, and then balance that with the long-term goals for the landscape, for the operation, and be careful with the animal performance thing as well, because stocking rate and animal performance can really be antagonistic to each other. And at the end of the day, we're looking at profit per acre that needs to happen. So something that's interesting, I see my timer has stalled here. How are we doing? We're getting
It's 8:25. Sorry, it's 7:25 for you. It's 8:25 for many of us in Ontario.
okay, so we got probably what, 15 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yeah, let's call it 10 so we've got a bit of time for some questions.
Sure. Okay. I can buzz through this real quick. So right now, obviously the grain markets are just exploding. Like, it's crazy. If you have a pasture that you could grow a grain crop on, anybody who has any realm of sanity is thinking about how they can grow a grain crop today. But looking at this, I was looking at the Canfax weekly market report. So last week, they're on internet sales. So this is real numbers. Somebody forward contracted or pre-sold October delivery heifers at 1,000 pounds for $1.97 a pound. And in the same week, it would have been the same internet sale probably. You could have bought 662 pound heifer calves for $1.82. So the return on the gain here is huge. It's $2.26 a pound that the market was paying last week for that trade, if you will. And these pasture numbers. So if let's say 100 animal unit days, 150 or 200 animal unit days, you could run what are we at, acres per animal. So we're looking at, at 200, you're running less than an acre per head. And this is the number that's really interesting. So with those stocking rates, this is what you could get for a return on gain. This is before cost. So this is what I call it, like a gross product. But you could, and you would need to get a 1.5 pound a day gain average on those cattle to make this work. So clearly there is money to be made grazing, putting gain on grass when the cost of gain in the feedlot and the grain prices are so expensive. So I think that if you can find the cattle, and in this instance, I mean, this is real numbers. So there is opportunity if you're looking at it. It's just being aware of what's going on. So moving ahead there, I mentioned this lifter here, technology. That's something that I think about, and I'm not sure. Like I used to think I liked the grazing side of things because it was low tech. It's just management. You need the land, you need management. But I really wonder where the technology gains, where the opportunity are in these grazing systems. Certainly, like simple things like this Penzagro lifter made in Argentina. It really changes the grazing dynamic, what we can do with multiple moves per day. Like when it's not really affordable to be out there with the cattle all day moving them, you can set these up. But like what's next with that? I didn't really dig in too much into the collars, the GPS collars and that. I'm not sure where I sit on that. Certainly on an extensive range, it's got all kinds of potential, but on the more productive land and the tighter spaces, I don't know, if I can't get my head wrapped around how that would work in a scenario like what we're looking at here. And then of course, like marketing the system, like the beef business has really got slammed the last several years when we're hearing the methane emissions, it used to be we thought that beef red meat was harmful to your health, but now of course we know that the methane is not, like, it's cycling on its own in the atmosphere. It's not that big of a deal. The ruminants been around forever. Ruminants are not what's causing the spike in methane in the atmosphere. So to really make the grazing system profitable, there's big opportunity in marketing that system. And I saw examples of that all over the place where folks were doing an effective job parlaying that message to the consumers. And I do believe that is the way of the future. The conscious consumer is going to be demanding quality raised meats. So the conclusions: grazing ruminants should be central to the fertility of the farming system. How do we do that? Ultra high stock density, grazing perennials, water infiltration is a priority, thinking about how we can add value with the market. And I never really talked about this here tonight at all, but like access to cheap energy, the fact that we can have fertilizer and the chemicals that are available, they allow us to be very efficient with what we produce in our grain farming systems, and that's okay. When will the day come that it'll be cost effective to have more grazing ruminants in there? I'm not sure, but I think in the short term, certainly cheap energy, which is not cheap today, things are changing rapidly. It's definitely a big factor. So Nuffield had a huge impact on me. I strongly encourage anybody that's involved in agriculture and is as curious and as I am and as passionate about farming and agriculture, to look up the Nuffield program, nuffield.ca. Every year in April, they take applications. I can't stress that enough. Like, check that out, put your application in. If you have any questions, look me up. I'd be happy to talk more in depth about just what the program is involved with. So yeah, thank you. There's the kids there. They grow up fast. That was prior to Nuffield. That was taken last fall. So they're growing just as fast as anything. And yeah, let's all eat some beef. And I'll be happy to take some questions here now and see if anybody has anything to debate or wants to know more about some of the things I'm suggesting here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So we've had some questions come in during your talk. And so I'd like to start off with a few more to provide a bit more context around where you're farming, because it is a bit different from our environment here in Ontario. So how many days typically is the grazing season in your part of the country? Like, kind of, when do you start grazing, when do you end?
So that really depends on you. I'm just going to make sure I get we got the screen share stop there now, right?
Yes, we do. Yep.
Yeah. So sorry, I should have set that up better myself. But so we're in Manitoba, north of Brandon. So we're about 100 miles north of about 70 miles north of the U.S. border. Grazing season, typically we would start grazing. Some years we'd be thinking about grazing now, but that's obviously not every year. Most typically it's first, second week in April that we'll be grazing stockpiled grass. We don't usually see a lot of green grass until mid-May, like significant amount of green grass. And then on the other end of it, we usually have a hard killing frost, early October. A lot of years we can graze right till Christmas. It really depends on how far the temperature drops, how cold it gets, and how much snow cover we get. Like last year, we were grazing corn stubble, like stover, till almost Christmas time, but then it was just getting too cold and snow getting deep that it makes more sense to stop doing that. So certainly a little bit different than what the eastern front down there is seeing.
Yeah, and you mentioned that your farm's on the black soil zone. Do you know offhand roughly how much precipitation per year is typical?
Totally, yeah. So I think Environment Canada might say we get like 15 inches of rain. That would probably include the snow as with that. And I mean, when I keep track of it, we can range from 8 inches. That would be like drought scenario. It's pretty dry at that of precipitation, and when the ground is thawed, to we've had years well over 20. If I get a year with 20 inches of rain, it's like, yeah, it's happy days. There's lots of grass.
For sure. So yeah, it is drier than us here, which is, I think, important context, because we did get some questions around that rest period, your once a year grazing kind of thing, and that precipitation piece does factor into how fast grass recovers. So how can you tell after that total grazing when a pasture's recovered? What are you looking for in those plants?
Yeah, so what I'm looking for, so first off, some of the plants are going to be over recovered, but I'm looking for new seedlings getting established. Are they, like, if there are little guys coming in there, are they big enough? Are we going to damage them if we do come in and graze? But Graham Hand, he would tell you when the plant has started to senesce some of the bottom leaves, that's where your litter is going to come from, some of those basal leaves. So I would say in our scenario, when is it ready to graze is certainly when it's more of a time thing too, because with our days so long, I would say, well, when the seed head comes up, but as you saw that one picture I had of the close-up shot of the sicer and the grass, it was very dense and lush and green. That was in like late summer, and that had been grazed early summer. So is that recovered enough? Well, I didn't see an like there was no rush to get back there and graze that because the time of year in the spring when we grazed it was such that it didn't want to put a seed head up. So all that was doing was just keep adding leaves. Like I could have pulled those leaves up and they'd be 2 feet long. So it's very context dependent, and that part of it is as much an art as a science, I think, is when it's recovered. And typically I would say the recovery period that you should be doing is much longer than you're doing now, I think would be that would be a general statement.
And are there any challenges with maintaining forage quality with those long recovery periods?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is going to be the biggest challenge, the largest hurdle to get over, because like I said, prior to grazing that with the severe non-selective grazing, like you probably want to have a long recovery period prior to that, just to simply have enough volume to do that. So yeah, the forage is going to become overripe. So, and that's when I think we really have to think about supplementing, like some kind of strategic protein supplementation to allow the cattle to digest and process some of that overripe stuff, because it's like you can graze earlier if you're worried about quality, but then it's a short-sighted deal, because then you're going to be compounding going backwards as opposed to forward. Like the quality is poor the first time, but once you do that high density grazing, the next grazing is when you're going to start to see the improvement. So that a 60-day recovery, or let's say 100-day recovery today is going to be poor quality feed, but if you can somehow figure a way to get over that hump when you do that high density grazing, the regrowth on that 100 days later is going to be massively improved quality, and it'll hold on to its quality much better as well. So it's I think that's where the supplement comes in, and that's where I was saying, like, having cattle that can efficiently deal with that is definitely an advantage. But I also think one of the things that we sometimes limit ourselves in the grazing world is we're grazing purists. We're not willing to supplement. We want to be just grazers. I'm a grass farmer and that's it. Whereas, you know, if we're in that stalker scenario where I showed, like, there's huge gains to be made background in cattle right now. You know, what if we were to supplement 4 or 5 pounds of grain on pasture? I said grain on pasture, like that seems like sacrilege to a lot of people, but even at today's prices, if that could ensure you 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds of gain, man, there's money, like there's potentially profit to be had doing that. So it goes back to where the thing, like cattle's place in the agro ecosystem, ruminants' place in ecology is to upcycle those coarse, highly fibrous forages. So by not allowing them to do that, we're taking away that competitive advantage that ruminant has. So trying to get our mindset shifted to, okay, we have allowed the quality to decline, but I have twice as much of it there than there would have been otherwise. That's kind of the thought process.
Thanks. You mentioned that when you start grazing in April, you're doing that on stockpiled grass that you've carried over from the previous year. So
Yep.
how do you decide whether to use that grass in the fall or carry it over to the spring?
So in the fall time, we get cold really quick, like I said, and the snow can come. And what we've found is it's a performance issue. The cattle just don't do very well on that stockpile in the fall, we find, and so we burn through it so much quicker. If we can leave it till spring, we also accomplish we keep that ground covered for the winter. So then that grass going into spring, like in April, it could be +10, whereas in October, November, it could be -10. So in April, if we go into spring with stockpile, that grass will take off. It'll grow much quicker the next spring. And the cattle are also at a different stage of pregnancy, like they're dried off as opposed to lactating in the fall. So the cattle can do better on it in the spring. So we like to leave as much as possible in the spring. What we typically try to graze in the fall is crop residues if available.
All right, thank you. So we are a little over time now. So thank you so much, Ryan. It was a very engaging talk, and I'm going to hand things back over to Terry to just kind of close out for the evening.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. That was an excellent talk, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. That is much appreciated. Thanks again to our sponsors, Beef Farmers of Ontario, Ontario Sheep Farmers, Minto Ag Limited, and SGS Canada Laboratories for the support of these webinars. It is much appreciated, and we appreciate the support from the industry on that end. So that wraps up our webinar series and the Profitable Pastures for 2022. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.